Thank you so much. So without further ado, may I please request the first FMD speaker to take the floor. Thank you.
I'm just going to test my mic first. Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible. Good to go.
Great. 3, 2, 1. ASEAN, in its conception as an economic bloc, was never able to foresee that the law that they made, which is called the non-interference policy, would cause countries to be able to get scot-free from genociding certain groups of individuals. We point you to the example of the Rohingya issue, where these individuals are raped, their houses burned, and they are forced to move out of Myanmar. And for that, the specific reason that the non-interference policy is still in place, no countries was able to dissent or call out Myanmar on their particular action. With that particular context, I have a few points of clarifications to be made. The first, what is this debate necessarily about? This debate is necessarily an assessment of the efficacy of ASEAN as of right now, and whether or not ASEAN can take larger forms of responsibility when it comes to moderating the way in which countries govern themselves, especially when it comes to the ASEAN Charter of Human Rights and its implementation within these individual nations. The second clarification that I would like to make here is the burden for each teams and the things that they have to prove. The teams have to prove that the way forward for ASEAN is either to probably stay and have the policy of non-interference, or to change those structures and make sure that ASEAN is a political union that becomes more politically integrated, that ensures that accountability exists, at least when it comes to nations whose capacity to abuse their power is much larger than the citizens can handle. Now, the third clarification that I would like to make here is in regards to how the transformation for ASEAN looks like as of right now when they turn into a political union. So obviously, as I pointed out, multiple problems with the non-interference policy. We will remove that particular policy. We will introduce integrated parliament as well, much like the EU, where there are certain laws that are required for countries necessarily, things like ASEAN Charter of Human Rights, things like the laws against pollution, especially against Indonesia within this particular sense, are the kind of things that will have to be implemented by nations. And oftentimes these are the kind of laws that are asked or required for nations to implement within their individual state anyways. As per the EU, we don't think that there's just like that much of a change that all forms of laws have to be revamped in favor of ASEAN. There are certain laws that concerns humanity and concerns each other that must be implemented by those individual nations. We will also introduce a court system in ASEAN, whereby individuals are now at least are able to access justice when they no longer have a choice within their own nation. They can apply towards the ASEAN court, and we think to have judicial independence, we will have representation from each countries, and those things will be fairly distributed amongst countries through via votes, for example, as well as via certain via votes, right? So three arguments for you today. The first, it's in regards to the principle of ASEAN and why for too long they have stood by oppression and crimes against humanity, and why they must act against those actions as of right now. The second argument will be a preemptive argumentation in regards to whether or not countries would leave ASEAN at the point where it transforms itself into a political union. The third argument would be a characterization of our counterfactual in regards to what happens when ASEAN is transformed. So the first question, why ASEAN has for too long stood by the oppression and crimes against humanity, and they must act actively against those actions as of right now. We will concede that ASEAN within its initial conception was only an economic bloc, but things are different now. In its conception, territorial disputes and ideological warfare was extremely strife, for the reason that colonization happened and that divided countries into becoming enemies with each other. For example, when the Dutch left Indonesia and after and they fought off the Dutch, for example, and then only would Malaysia would to gain their own independence. At that particular point of time, Indonesia was unable to reconcile with the fact that there's another independent country at that particular point of time, and the ideological warfare between Malaysia and Indonesia was extremely strife Thus, we will understand if within back then there's no ability for it to have a political union at that point of time. But there are things as of right now have changed. What are these kind of things? These are things like Singapore asking Indonesia to limit its pollution because of the haze problems that affected multiple countries like Malaysia, like Philippines, like Singapore themselves, as well as other ASEAN nations, particularly because of the fact that there was no actual laws to limit Indonesia's capacity in polluting the airspace within the ASEAN region. It also looks like Malaysia discussing issues about the labor that they import from Indonesia they import from Indonesia, and whether or not certain payments of wages are fair. Within countries now at least are more willing to engage with one another on a diplomatic basis, and that showcases at least that there's a change when it comes to the incentive structures of nations to be able to integrate with one another more. Now, the second level to this is why ASEAN is directly complicit when it comes to the crimes against humanity that have occurred. We would say that the non-interference policy have limited any form of dissent, and note this is important given that this is just how the non-interference policy works, that countries are unable to comment on the policies of certain nations, that they are unable to make perhaps certain judgments to not judgments as in like they can't take like legal actions or whatever for those nations because of the fact that they shouldn't interfere within the sovereignty of those particular nations. Those things have directly allowed for the Rohingya crisis to happen. We think that at the point where people are raped because of the policy that was implemented by ASEAN themselves, ASEAN becomes directly responsible for those harms to happen at the end of the day. We'll point to the second example of the Khmer Rouge genocide in Vietnam when it comes to genociding minority groups within that particular country at that point of time. ASEAN also was unable to act in any manner because of the fact that the non-interference policy was still implemented. We think that the non-interference policy have allowed countries to get away scot-free without any form of accountability, and we think especially when those harms are extremely pernicious, we cannot allow ASEAN to act within that particular manner. Second argument, will countries leave ASEAN when it's a political union? Three levels for you here. The first is in regards to the integrated economic ecosystem within ASEAN. Malaysia depends on Thailand for its rice exports. Thailand depends on Malaysia for palm oil, as well as its natural gases. Singapore requires the flow of goods from all individual nations from ASEAN to be able to have a functioning economic hub. And there's a lot of multifactorial things that exist within the economic system of ASEAN that allows them to work together. We think that makes it much harder for nations to leave at the point where ASEAN becomes a political union, thus our benefit can materialize. The second reason as to why they wouldn't leave is that the strength of ASEAN as an economic bloc is extremely huge, that it becomes a huge opportunity cost for countries if they were to leave. We think that the agreements oftentimes are made together as an economic bloc, and given that ASEAN is the third largest economic bloc in the world, they have that larger for capacity to discuss deals with China, for example, or probably with the US. The third level here is that leaving will also mean that ASEAN countries would have to limit themselves from trading with those nations who have left, given that the image of dealing with those nations and supporting crimes against humanity is something that would deter them from acting within that particular manner. What happens under a transformed ASEAN? Within the Charter of Human Rights now actually becomes legally binding, that this changes everything when it comes to the structures of ASEAN, especially when corruption and abuse of power is rife. At that point of time, when people don't have a choice, at least they can go to ASEAN and say they can and hope that they would save them. Thanks.
All right, I'll acknowledge the first affirmative speaker. Can we please have the first negative speaker?
Before that, can you give me a minute to switch my device? This is getting very erratic. I'll be back in
Sure. No problem. So we just wait for the educator to come in.
I'm here now.
Okay, so is everyone ready? Educators? Is everyone okay? Can we start? Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Actually, would it help if you switch your video off? I'm sorry, it's just a little unstable.
Sorry?
If you would switch your video off, I think that would help my connection.
Okay, yeah, sure, no problem, no problem.
Thank you.
Is it better now?
Much better.
Okay, all right, no problem. Okay, so may I please invite the first negative speaker?
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you are. You are.
No,
Please
I'll
go
just
ahead.
set the timer 5 seconds.
Sure, no problem.
All right. I'll be starting in 3. Just for the last time, I am audible, right?
Yes, you are. Yeah, you're
All right.
perfectly audible.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, ASEAN is a cultural and economic coordination currently in support of growth of the nations in the way it helps them, which means non-interference in internal matters, reduction of conflicts, cultural aspects, and economic progress and growth. The problem is this, right? When you go ahead and form this as a political union, the kind of overshadowing that happens in terms of the kind of benefits that ASEAN offers to these countries, in terms of economic benefits, etc., significantly go down. But on the other hand, the kind of economic problems, the kind of human rights problems and other political problems that side government characterizes in this debate are also not solved. These are the two things that we'll be proving throughout our speeches. But what is a political union, right? Which means single political front stance, similarity in terms of the allies that you choose for your country, right? It also means political ideologies and consistent stances in terms of legislative problems, etc., etc., to show the entire region as a politically colluded and together region, right? But before anything else, right, understand a very important piece of context, which is why the debate stands relevant in today's house, right? China has tremendous amount of control on individual Asian countries, right? Which means right now, a lot of these countries individually are heavy on debt on China and are largely reliant on China to keep their economies very smoothly function, which means China has indirect control on a lot of these countries through control, through deficits, through trade relations, etc. A lot of these countries are dependent on China in terms of trade partnership, which means because of lesser involvement of Western countries in Southeast Asian region, the kind of political power that China has gained over so many of these countries by like setting up their trade relations, strong trade relations, is significant, which also manifests in the form of China's control of Mekong River, on which a lot of these countries are dependent, which manifests into the form of countries like Cambodia and Myanmar not being successful economies and largely being reliant on China for being able to give these countries support in case of these issues. The center and head offices, a lot of these organizations being associated at Shanghai Cooperation Operation. We think these are the kind of things that become important in this debate, right? Because now when China individually has significant amount of control on a lot of these countries, when you go ahead and uniformize the kind of political stance that these countries take, it's very, very likely that China, that has a largely expansionist policy in South China Sea, that has a largely expansionist policies in terms of controlling the economies of these countries and who they trade with and the political stance that these countries take, it becomes largely obvious for these countries that their political decisions, that the kind of interactions they have when they project themselves as a political forum, would be highly determined by how China sees it in the first place, right? We think this sort of political cooperation, when manifests into the ground, as a government says, like taking stances on different issues, etc., is not something which will happen, right? Why? Because these countries have to show themselves as a political front. We don't understand why every other country would be going ahead and and ruining its relation with some other country, which facing through largely volatile relations and like going ahead and not presenting itself as a political front. Like, we think most of the conflicts that are taking place in individual countries are the conflicts of varying degrees, with different amounts of separatist factions existing, with different levels of volatility existing. The side government has to prove to us why a unionization of other countries, a unionization of this particular country would lead to curbing of these things, right? Why? Because we see due to extensive amount of trade dependence of so many countries and the collusions and like oligopoly existing in the oil market, this never deterred Middle Eastern countries from going and engaging in political rifts, right? This never deterred from those countries, despite the common shared profit, to go ahead and engage in the mutual wars that have been extending through decades, right? We think when it comes to the stance of taking a political stance when the entire country is in conflict, like the Rohingyas Muslims the case, etc., we think these sort of countries, the kind of prioritization that they hold in terms of their economic growth in the midst of an extensive amount of conflict is not huge enough for them to consider staying in the region and then going through the humiliation of being sidelined by other countries. We think what will happen eventually, as we told you through our stance, that these countries will have a tendency of withdrawing, right? Why? Because now they also have the backing of countries like China. We tell you that this becomes even largely more problematic because now all the other countries unionize and believe that it's okay for them to politically criticize other countries for the stance that are taken. A, there is no impact caused. B, the chances of leaving these countries become significantly more because now China would always be on the helm of these political organizations, playing soft power over so many of these countries, because now the amount of progress that Chinese market has shown in the global scenario, especially in the post-pandemic area, is significant. We think, therefore, the kind of threshold that exists for these countries to withdraw out of it is not significant. We think other solutions that side government suggests, like separate court system, separate system, etc., does not work in these countries. Right? This is where the characterization of the region comes in. We believe the regions that exist in the Asian partnership, a lot of these countries have different varying degrees of economic growth, varying degrees of interdependence on each other. Some countries like Thailand and specific cities like Singapore being extensively successful, a lot of countries like Cambodia, etc., not being equivalently successful and being largely dependent on countries like China. Right? We think when you go ahead and form these political unions, you uniformize the kind of action that these countries will have to take. For example, now Vietnam, that shares a border with China and is largely affected by Chinese policies and the way the Chinese attitude exists toward this country, will be forced to take a stance that is going to be beneficial for all the other countries, and in this particular scenario, forced to take a back stance and remain quiet in this scenario. We think it's extremely problematic when most of these countries are not economically independent and require individual strategies, individual allies and partners in order to go ahead and have a strategic frame of growth for themselves, especially in the post-pandemic region. We think a formation of a political alliance in this case, rather than like strong arming of China in this particular political alliance, it also leads to hampering of individual countries which are not on the top of their on the economic power to go ahead and have and like limit in terms of the kind of deals that they can make, the kind of trade allies, the kind of other allies that they can have. Right? We think this largely affects these smaller unions and smaller countries when they have to form and stay committed to the idea of a singular political identity. We also tell you that the kind of economic coordination and the binarization that exists in Asian countries is not very uniform. Right? Like Laos and Vietnam having constant truffle at their borders and constant rifts, right? We think when you go ahead and make this a political organization, the kind of benefits that you're able to provide these countries in terms of economic growth significantly goes down, which means right now, smaller countries like Taiwan, they get at risk because now, given the unionization of this union and strong arming of China, the kind of stances that they have to take for their autonomy, the kind of stances that they will have to take right now for their own safety, something that will largely be hampered because now ASEAN represents itself as like a political organization with certain specific roots. Right? We also tell you how this strong arming is going to be even more problematic. The way political organizations and political unions work, dear panel, understand the hierarchy that exists, the top-down organizations, the top-heavy organizations and controlling, and the kind of commitment that has to exist in terms of unionization and formation of certain particular political formulas throughout these countries is something that backfires on a lot of these countries that that are going through other severe problems. We think non-uniform kind of struggles that exist throughout these countries makes it the best for them to be able to independently form political alliances, requires them to go ahead and take these decisions for them internally. We think the kind of interference that each of them face with like countries like China and other neighboring countries also makes sure that if they are all forced into a political union, the political union is largely going to be unsuccessful, and it's going to come at a compromise with the benefits that they had previously in terms of the trade relations, something that would not have happened if it existed as a trade union. Very proud to oppose.
All right, the House acknowledges the first negative speaker. May I please request the second affirmative speaker to take the floor?
Sorry, just give me a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, sure, no problem, no problem. Is it okay if you like turn off the camera because one of the adjudicators is having an issue, right? Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, okay.
Okay, just setting my timer right now.
No problem.
If you listen closely to what the site narrative says, is that we only give one example of China and why China will be bad, but they made the entire case by misrepping us to say that all we care about is China. We think that they need to be more dynamic and more charitable to the entire argument that came from first affirmative, but we don't think that they have successfully done that in their speech. I'm going to answer 5 key things in this debate. The first, let's talk about whether or not if we have a political union means we will homogenize political structures within ASEAN. Second, let's talk about the ability for ASEAN to be able to counter Chinese aggression. Third, let's talk about will countries draw out from ASEAN. And fourth, that we will then look at whether or not these countries deserve the absolute self-sovereignty, all of which the materials that was not responded by negative at all. First, let's address political union. They said that political union, if we have political union, means that we will homogenize political structures within ASEAN. But they conflate that particular analysis by saying that if we go political, which means that we will deprive these countries from all the economic benefits that they would have had without the interference policy. I'm going to prove why that's just unlikely. Because if Singapore and Malaysia is extremely exploitative, and then by imposing high tariffs against Vietnam or Cambodia, for example, that also impacts the ability for Malaysia and Singapore to be able to have treaties with Cambodia as well. That means that if high tariffs means that we also have to fork out even more money to be able to counter and absorb the high tariffs that we ourselves impose to Cambodia, which means it is unlikely that all these big ASEAN nations are going to be extremely exploitative as how the negative accuses us to be. So we don't think that the conflation that they made in the first analysis was even right to begin with. But second, I'm going to answer why is it that if we have ASEAN as a political union, it means that we are able to counter Chinese aggression. Because look at the analysis from First Neck. They said they were confident by telling us that we can push back against China if we don't have a political union. But then under the same breath, they also say that China is bad. They give the entire like a huge characterization of why China is bad, which means they also concede that that is because China is bad, because we have nation states who are still vulnerable to Chinese aggression, but things like loan debt, like debt trap from China, for example, means that all the more reason for us to gather our strength and maximize our strength so that we are able to push back against China. Let's just listen to the response from First Neck. There's no alternative because they were trying to be convenient in their claim. They don't prove how is it that Laos can counter Chinese demands, given that Laos are Laos markets are just financially weaker. Laos has less ability to stand up against China because they are vulnerable, because they just have a financially weaker market at the end of the day, which means that China is able to take advantage of Laos at the end of the day. But let's compare that if you have a political union, which means that we are able to tell Laos to not take certain offers from China, because that will fundamentally be counterproductive to China, to Laos economy. We think at this point, because we have the interference policy right now, so we don't look, so then Laos will more likely listen to Malaysia or Singapore, because we don't see this as an insult to our sovereignty, but rather it's another friend helping out another friend at the end of the day. So we don't think that we cannot necessarily counter Chinese aggression, but more importantly, we think it is even more crucial to be a political union so that we're able to become a bigger bargaining power to be able to counter Chinese aggression. We think that maximizes our ability to say no to China and to stop China from invading us. That's why we think the political union is important. But thirdly, then this weird argument from them. They're saying that if you have a political union, means suddenly countries will not draw out from China, so draw out from ASEAN. So we'll suddenly have this ASEAN version of Brexit for some reason. We think this is just a huge assumption, because it's unrealistic to status quo. We think that most ASEAN countries are already pulling out for China. We see Malaysia pulled out from developmental projects. We've seen Thailand pull out from developmental projects. And we already learned from Cambodia's airport project that massively harms Cambodia and the ability for them to run their businesses, because China puts them in a debt trap. We think at that point, we don't think that countries will want to draw out from China, will want to draw from ASEAN, because it just means that they are losing out economically from if they pull out, it means that they won't be able to enjoy all the treats that we would have had because when they were in ASEAN at that point in time. But even if we were to buy this particular argument, right? Even if China will be bad, we think that's not mutually exclusive, because China is already bad, it's already predatory. That means that if in order for them to explain why is it that the countries who suddenly want to draw from ASEAN, given that they have already been able to reap the rewards by being in ASEAN, and suddenly be friends with China and suddenly be be able to counter Chinese aggression, if they wanted to take that big burden, they needed to prove why is it how they're able to prove that burden. But second, they were also unresponsive to the entire material that came from First F, because they were unresponsive to our characterization of what is currently happening within ASEAN. Things like the Philippines, for example, we have your Duterte, who is a dictator who actively seeks war, who actively, implementing war on drugs, that actively unjustly targets individuals who are suspected to use drugs, for example. We think at that point, there is no one who is able to hold the Philippines accountable for their crimes against humanity. We think at that point, if we have political unions, it means that we're able to drag Duterte to be able to answer for all his crimes against the public. We think it's more effective, because when it's public, everybody knows about it. When it's public, that means that you're able to drag the Philippine authorities to court. We think at that point, our unique benefit that they will never be able to claim is that we will be able to force conversations about what the Philippines or what Myanmar is currently doing. We think at that point, we tell them, if you continue to commit crimes against humanity, we will make you suffer the consequences. We will limit your trade. We will impose visa onto your workers, for example. This is the only way for us to be able to get them to be answerable for their actions. We are able to call out Duterte. We're able to call out Myanmar and what they did to the Rohingyas. At that point, without the interference policy, you are the side who is currently siding with the oppressors, and we want them to learn from what happened in Cambodia in the 70s. We think we had no response, therefore we think that side negative actually agrees that we can hold them accountable with this policy. Fifthly, we also think that they were unable to answer why is it that it's okay. They were unable to answer our principal justification as to why is it that it's okay for us to interfere in another country's stuff, right? Because even if we were to buy the fact that they are free to govern themselves, but their freedom stops at that point where the spillover effects are massive to the interests of humanity. Negative needs to show why is it justified to let other countries to stay on the side, turn a blind eye on the genocide, turn a blind eye on the crimes against humanity that other states are doing. But crucially, self-sovereignty can never be absolute, and they were unable to respond to this principle. We see trends as to why is it that we are okay with why self-sovereignty isn't absolute. Things that the EU of human courts, for example, when we interfere in a country's political landscape, when they are silent on things like on the crimes that members are doing. For example, the refugee crisis that's increasing by today. The refugee crisis is a collective obligation of the European courts because inaction impacts the EU as a whole. We've seen how it impacts them as a whole. But we also see things like Malaysia and Singapore had to create a bilateral treaty on their own in order to combat the pollution that Indonesia had in their country months before. We think the action or the treaty, if we were to make treaties, right, at that point it was already too late because you already incurred all the harms as well. If you have the interference, it's binding. That means at the point where we tell them stop causing forest fires, they will have to adhere by those things. And we think it is principally justified for us to interfere in their nation and how the political landscape looks like.
Right, I'll acknowledge the second affirmative speaker. May I please request the second negative speaker to take the floor? Is the second negative speaker ready? We cannot hear you.
Yeah, just 10 seconds, she'll be here.
Yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah. The second negative speaker is not audible.
I think she's refreshing her internet. She said that she has a...
Okay. All right, no problem. Yeah, like just clarifying, that
Yeah, she actually got out of breakout room. She's just getting in. Just a second.
Okay, all right, no problem. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah,
I'm
we can hear
really
you.
sorry. Yeah, I'll just
Okay.
begin and let me set my timer. So sorry.
Yeah, no problem. All right. I hope all the others can hear.
I'm good, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Yep, thank you so much. Yeah, whenever the speaker is ready.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, start. First, rebuttal with respect to international pressure, right? Principally, we think the economies of different countries are not so strong for them to go forward and like put economic sanctions, for example, to counterbalance the kind of activities one other country is doing in Southeast Asian region countries, right? Which is to say that even if like the other countries start going against some country for like whatever Rohingya crisis, etc., one understand that they also help our case itself when we talk about how when political problems get prominence over other economic economic integration and other aspects of like a union, you tend to make the situation more volatile, and that is something which they've agreed with their own analysis. But even with respect to what extent is like international pressure coming through these poorer countries themselves going to help is something which is debatable, right? We don't think that they are in a situation to go forward and say isolate one country completely from the particular economy, and hence like put pressure on that country to not go forward and continue with whatever atrocities it is doing, simply because separatist factions exist in multiple countries within the Southeast Asian regions, right? And we don't think Myanmar is like the only sole example. We think furthermore, in staying isolated with respect to your political situations also helps like international countries, other international countries, to put more burden on you, to put more pressure on you. For example, how US put sanctions on Myanmar in isolation without affecting other countries as a whole, right? We think all of these situations become much more problematic because it's very stupid to assume that political unions will always go forward in the benefit of like humanity and etc. We think it varies, right? We think it'll depend upon to what extent like the other countries are impacted by the refugee crisis in one particular region, right? Which is why like saying that it is necessarily going to be like a common stance to not allow Myanmar to go forward and do what it is doing is not something which we buy. We think, on the contrary, it can also be isolating itself from political criticism around the world, and hence international pressure can also become difficult from countries which are actually relevant to go forward and create some sort of burden on Myanmar as a whole, because they have that kind of leverage, like countries like America, for example, right, who have that kind of leverage and have that kind of economic situation right now where they can afford to go forward and do so in this. But understand what is the aim of ASEAN right now, right? We think it emphasizes on consultation, it emphasizes on some sort of consensus, and ensures that there is it navigates through the various diverse political problems that exist within the countries. We think there are multiple border conflicts, there are separatist factions, etc. In that way, like when you don't go forward and prioritize political problems over other situations, you take that is like a non-intervention and essentially take like a non-interventionist route. You essentially have more way of navigating through these problems to then go forward and talk about a common goal, right? We think like what is then the difference between any union like the current union and a political union, right? We think countries maintain some sort of sovereignty in either of the regions, and that is not something which we're debating on. What we're debating on is what the nature of the union should look like. In a political union, the political problems, the border conflicts, etc., gain prominence over other forms of integration of economies, right? Which is to say that if you take an example of say US-China trade war, which is probably a very bad economic decision, but was motivated solely for political reasons, is something which is likely to happen in like this region itself, but it is going to suffer much more because the economies are not so much strong, right? Which is to say that the current plan of ASEAN goes forward and benefits the lowest common denominator within these countries, and which is what we want, right? We don't want some countries to get more prominence over the other countries simply because they have more political power, etc., etc. We don't want that to happen, and we don't want to stifle and make the situation more volatile over there. Understand what is our main argument before I go on to rebutting some of their other arguments, right? Understand that most of these countries have differing political situations, right, with respect to to the extent to which they interact with China and the extent to which they have border issues with the neighboring countries, right? Which is to say that having like a common political union, just like forming a common political union, does not by automatically go forward and dissolve these kind of political differences that has existed within the country for so long. What do I mean by that? I'll give you some context. One, Vietnam, for example, is a country which is more exposed, which has its border more exposed to South China Sea, etc., etc., which is why it has more pressure to look for alternate allies. On the contrary, Cambodia, for example, has 26% of its trade coming from China, right? We think countries like Laos have turned from being more largely neutral to favoring China. We think both of these, and by that logic, Cambodia and Laos are largely dependent on China for their economic development, and hence essentially go forward and try to do the best they can to like not make China angry against them, right? On the contrary, countries like Thailand, etc., have some sort of Western influence, etc., etc. We think countries like Singapore, etc., also have some sort of Western influence and are not completely under Chinese hegemony as compared to the other countries. With respect to their differing interactions with China and differing political situations in general, we think there is going to be like a conflict when it becomes a political union. What that means is that if as a political union you have to take a common stance and form common allies, because that is what political ideologies do, we think in that situation either all the other countries are going to be pulled down because one country is dependent on China, and the others, even if they have alternative measures or even if they want to look for alternative won't be able to go forward and do so because it contradicts their political stance. We think in that situation, it pulls down all the countries together, and even the countries which have scope of growth and which can have trickle down impacts on the economy as a whole of the Southeast Asian region. What then is going to be the outcome, which we believe is going to happen, is that these other countries who are powerful then go out and essentially do not form a part, and essentially do not remain a part of the ASEAN, etc., etc. And this is very likely to happen if you force a country to form alliance with a country with a country which does not benefit itself but the other country, and we don't think they are in a situation to prioritize that kind of situation, right? Prioritize that kind of stance, right? With that, understand what is then going to happen, right? We think they have varying leverage over the other countries as well. Like, for example, to say that there is no understanding between these countries is false. We think in a non-interventionist ways as well, there are countries which have maintained some sort of understanding so as to not make the situation very, very volatile. For example, Thailand and Cambodia have some sort of understanding to not engage in border conflicts, etc., etc. But understand why this becomes worse off when you form a political union, right? You have to take stances on issues in a political union, which is to say that depending upon to what extent particular countries are impacted by the situation in other countries, they are going to take stances on this. And we think more generally, countries which have, say, more military, etc., etc., more political power are the countries who are going to be dominated in this, and rest of the other countries are going to be and going to go forward and become a part and support this particular country regardless of what the situation looks like. What this does is that this makes the entire situation more fragile when countries actively go forward and take a stance against some other countries, right? And this divides them even further. What can this look like, right? This can look like Middle East trying to having like a dependent economy in terms of oil, but still going forward and engaging in political problems, which then has impacts in terms of different countries holding different oil reserves, etc., which impacts a lot of countries and results into a lot of civil wars, right? We think this looks like different countries going forward and investing more in their military so that they go forward and stand strong against the neighboring country. For example, Laos investing more in military because Vietnam already has like a military superiority. We think a political problem in one region is going to have a spillover effect on other regions in the Southeast Asian country, because our countries will have to take a stance in the atmosphere of a political union, right? We think like understand like what China. We don't think China hegemony can go over so easily. We think it controls Mekong River, right? Which is to say that kind of dependency cannot go away. But what you essentially can ensure will not happen is that China should not get the benefit of volatility increasing within the Southeast region sphere. Which is to say that like if there's a problem between Laos and Vietnam and there's a political rift, we think what this directly benefits countries who are sharing. This directly benefits China, who is sharing the Southeast, who is currently present in the South China Sea islands, etc., because it can hegemonize over the political situations over there and divide countries even further for its own profit incentives, etc. We think this kind of situation is worse off, and the only way out is to have a non-interventionist policy so that you can navigate through these complex problems and essentially ensure some sort of common understanding and have some sort of give some sort of freedom to individual countries to go forward and get the best that they can through all the given alternatives. Very, very proud to.
All right, that was acknowledges the second negative speaker. May I please request the third affirmative speaker to take the floor?
Hi, just give me a minute. I just need to set my timer.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, cool. I think it's very weird for Site Negative to just put all of their benefits upon establishing some level of good connections with China, but completely not responding with how we've told you the context as to which how ASEAN countries as this particular region ability for them to trade and politically intertwine with each other also creates a very huge chunk of benefits as well. But also, I do not know how they want to deal with China being this sort of like an aggressor and bully to these smaller nations as well. When I think we can prove to you that if ASEAN was a very strong economical bloc and now becomes a strong political union, there is an ability for them to best deal with China in order for us to protect these smaller nations nations such as like Laos and Vietnam, who are probably economically have some level of power symmetry when it comes to China. I think these other nations such as, I don't know, Singapore or Malaysia could also help out when it comes to best dealing with these things. But before going on into key issues, let's just deal with this issue base, right? Number one, let's talk about this non-interference policy, which we never heard a proper defense of on side negative. Second, which side gets better standards for human rights? Third, let's talk about China, since they want to make this debate about it. And third, what will the relationship between nations look like? Which is something that I think side negative never wants to talk about, because they think that if nations just have some level of trade with China, everything is good and dandy. But before that, I think when it comes to the non-interference policy, they haven't properly dealt with this, right? I think from the start, Zazu has told you that the justification of non-interference policy just because they wanted some level of economic benefits, because they don't want to interfere with nation building and stuff like that. I think it's terrible because you're justifying economic benefits over the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. It's not just issues such as like the Rohingyas from Myanmar. It's also in things such as like how Malaysia government exploits labor force from Indonesia, or maybe to an extent even Philippines. These are the kind of things that occur to which people need to start discussing about these things and gain some level and impacts that are proper through channels such as like a parliamentary seating or some level of going to court and demanding for justice. These are the kind of things that we can get. Under their side, we haven't properly heard as to why it is still fair for them to defend these non-interference policies when there is obviously such a big harm. Second issue, which side gets better standards for human rights, right? We've told you that when there is a level of unified ASEAN, right? That things such as an ability for them to table things in parliament, an ability for individuals to ask for some level of justice at court. We think the ability for human rights violation to be discussed at these levels means that you can keep nations accountable, right? Why would they listen, right? I think in discussions in parliament, these are things that are done in public. I think they kind of care about public image. I think you also forces nations to face consequences by saying like, if you do not do this, if you do not make sure that your individuals are being taken care of, or you are abiding by the standards that we've all agreed upon, we think that will limit things such as like trade, will limit things such as like labor exchange, which are things that obviously have massive consequences to developing nations that are just trying to grow economically. I think these are the kind of incentives that we would want individuals to listen to, since considering that they're not listening to the people in their own country. I think there are trends where ASEAN countries do care about like Rohingya individuals who are at sea just dying, right? I think like Aceh, people of Aceh, for example, like making sure that Rohingya boats can arrive safely, even though the Indonesian government didn't want them to. These are already showcases to you that individuals can now claim for these things at court. Notice also, how negative has zero response when it comes to all these human rights violations. They have zero attempts to make it better for the vulnerable. They're okay with Rohingyas dying at sea, just so that some nations can trade with China. Because China, apparently, they complain that because China doesn't care about human rights, you also don't have to care about human rights. No analysis as to why China would force you to do this. Because I think even if you trade with China, if your trade with Asian nations are at stake, yet you not complying by certain standards, like, okay, fine, you don't have to comply by a human rights violation or human rights standards with China. But at least if you comply by human rights standards with like ASEAN, I think there is an ability for you to gain trade. So I don't know why apparently you just lose out completely. I think there is an ability for these nations to comply because there's a level of accountability and making sure that they face certain consequences. Second, let's talk about China. They apparently assert that these nations are like different when it comes to the economic growth, so they need to be independent to build political alliances according to their needs, right? Because negative provides us with the context in which China basically controls ASEAN, as if that's the only trade that they do. Not responding to how we told you economically, ASEAN nations are heavily intertwined. They have the third biggest economic bloc. I think if we do a political union, they can be stronger. They told us that China will be the cause as to why these states will back out of ASEAN, because will back out of ASEAN in order for them to protect some level of trade with China. I think even if circumstances, if China is dangling their particular trade in front of them, I don't think China would like. I think like trade with ASEAN is also another opportunity cost that you wouldn't want to sacrifice, considering that a lot of your labor, a lot of your trade, majority of your trade deals is still contingent on ASEAN. So there is still something that the opportunity cost is too big for you to completely back out, because China in itself is predatorial, probably wouldn't exactly listen to a bunch of your needs. So I don't know why you're sacrificing ASEAN as a whole just because you want to deal with China. But also China, as per your characterization, being such a big bully to nations such as Laos and Vietnam, who economically are disadvantaged, you don't tell us how they'll be protected against China. Compare it to our side. And when ASEAN bloc becomes stronger, it can ensure that the deals that they get with China, the loans that aren't as predatorial, because there is a unified ASEAN that can at least agree upon some level of standards as to now how do we best deal with China, considering that they do have unified interests as to how they deal with China, considering that China is like doing things in Spratly Islands, for example, which is in close proximity with them. That means that they would have incentive as an ASEAN bloc to deal and reassess as to how they best deal with China. It means that nations such as Singapore and Malaysia now have a voice and ability for them to also defend nations such as Vietnam and Laos against China. I really think they don't get anything at all. Oh, before that, this whole thing about border conflict as well. Again, I don't know why they want to make this a thing when they don't even tell us as to how they solve. I think when nations are, they have, like ASEAN has a parliament, I think when nations are non-interference, they will have incentive to deal with it in parliament, in court. They wouldn't, because now there's an ability for nations to go like, if you do not deal with this, if you are putting boots on the ground and it affects other nations as well, that means we will have to take active, harsh measures against you when it comes to limiting trade. I think these are the kind of things that will help nations cause a level to which civil unrest wouldn't be something that is to an extent in which it harms other nations as well. Under your side, these atrocities would still happen and we don't know how you solve it. Lastly, what will these relationships between nations look like? We've told you the ASEAN region would do things such as the ability for them to have better trade, ability for them to at least agree upon some level of human rights standards, like something that they never get, something that they just want to push aside as if it's something that's not, people dying in this debate isn't important, by the way. Also, they seem to also assert that ASEAN nations are just all different, that's why there's no ability for them to have some similar level of political stances. I think they can, even though they are different, there's an ability for you to agree upon some level of universal standards or some level of like fair trade. These are the kind of agreements that at least can benefit other nations, all nations, an ability for them to get better trade and a better human rights standards, right? I think like the ability for them to care about other nations, because now they have an incentive to at least have a say in how certain nations govern themselves, because like you can justify it by saying things like, look, your civil unrest is affecting your ability to grow economically, affecting my ability to also trade with you, right? I think things such as like investor confidence as well will be affected because of your mass human rights violation. These are as to how now nations have an incentive to sort of police each other and to sort of care about how they treat each other. That means they would have a better symbiotic relationship that would ensure ASEAN's growth as a region. Never been prouder to propose.
All right, I'll acknowledge the third affirmative speaker. May I please request the third negative speaker to take the floor?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, just give me 1 second. I'll start my timer. Set my timer. Okay. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand the side affirmative's case has been a classic case of problem solution mismatch, right? And in order to prove any of their assumptions, they had to prove 3 basic assumptions, which they failed to do. 1, why do these countries have an incentive to collectivize on political issues and not withdraw from the political organization later when they see that their political identity and their economy as well as that is a threat? The second is, what incentive structures exist for the compliance of these human rights by these countries? And the third, why the breakdown of ASEAN won't happen in their scenario, leading to even worse economic problems, right? And the non-meeting of the objectives, right? But first, let us come to what the solution is and not political incentivization is, right? Understand the solution, which my previous speakers have already told, is more economic viability for these countries, more economic strength, and international pressure on individual countries and not political stance which worsens the scenario, right? But coming to the second major point of rebuttal, which they've completely failed to engage with us on, is to why will China aggression be more and not less in this paradigm, right? Understand, China does not care about human rights violations. China only cares about profits on a large scale, right? And that is its global policies, right? Understand, if their only incentive for these countries to go ahead and give up their criminals to these international pressure and stop human rights violations is now that the ASEAN won't trade with them, that the ASEAN will have lesser labor exchanges with them, understand understand China has a larger incentive in the Southeast Asian region and in the South China Sea as of a whole, right? Which is to say that now the individual countries are more likely to turn to China for funds, for trade deals, etc., because it does not have any of these conditions which are associated with the Asian right now, simply because of the kind of economic culpability and the kind of political culpability, and something which they have failed to engage with us on. And this is the first layer why China is far more incentivized to go ahead and work there, right? But also, we have told you in our previous speeches as to China wants more power and hegemony on the South China Sea, which means that it will want to go ahead and influence the political dynamics within there, influence the kind of economic dynamics within the Asian, which will lead to a further worsening of the border strides within these countries, something which we have already explained, but we will further explain to you as to why China aggression will be more, right? But on a third point of rebuttal, right, where they tell you this, right, that political incentivization will benefit all countries and economic incentives will force them to stay, right? 2 points of rebuttal to that and 3 sub points of rebuttal, right? The first is the idea of political incentives and why that won't work, right? 3 points of rebuttal to this. The first, we believe that the kind of that Asian only work because of the policy of non-interference, right? Just to say that dictators like Duterte in Philippines, he would not want to lose political power, right? Or countries like Myanmar did not fear prosecution by Asian within themselves, which means that is the only reason they cooperated within like the Asian, even in general, right? Just to say that now they do not have the political incentive, etc., to remain in the Asian as of a whole, right? But on a second level, understand the kind of fear of trials which will exist, right? 2 consequences to this. The first is the fear of trials won't work, which is like the most plausible scenario, simply because of the kind of working of ICC in general, right? Which is to say that the ICC structure works on like the countries giving out its own leaders or criminals, etc., for prosecution. The side affirmative had to explain to us why will the countries have an incentive to give up their leaders for prosecution, which is why the ICC does not work, and they have to prove to us, like for example, Omar al-Bashir is still not given up, and what incentive structure does it have to like punish the criminals or to stop the genocide, etc., right? But also let us take place on the best case scenario for the side affirmative, where they say, hey, you know what, the kind of courts, the kind of parliaments, etc., it is going to work, right? Understand 2 points to why the countries now have an incentive to pull out of this entire political consolidation a few years down the line, right? 1, the kind of incentive they have for political consolidation, according to their own model, the kind of dictators who have a lot of power in these countries, they will not want to lose their power, which means that now they will turn to China, they turn to like other political opinions, etc., which is going to work, which is going to worsen the situation even further, right? And now this power consolidation and fear of prosecution is going to disincentivize them from staying in the Asian or for supporting the kind of political stances of Asian, right? But also the third idea, as to which Mirambika explained in her speech, as to how there will become a race for power in Asian, right? Understand, when the principle of non-interference goes away, the countries want to maintain their own individual identity within the Asian. They want to maintain their own individual political atmosphere and their own political identity, and in order to avoid prosecution, etc., right? Which means that it becomes a top-heavy institution, right? Understand what this race for power does. 2 consequences to this. The first is the kind of economic backing it will need in order to go ahead and maintain its power, or to go ahead and create leaders for the Asian in itself. But also second, how it worsens the border stripes, etc., because now the countries have an incentive to actively disengage and engage with the kind of context, simply because they want this kind of power for themselves, right? Because they do not want to be prosecuted, etc., right? It is a burden of affirmative to prove why this kind of top-down breakage of the entire system won't happen, right? Second, the entire idea which the side affirmative gives is the economic incentive to stay. 3 points of rebuttal to this as to why that is a problem, right? Understand the first, economic incentive to stay does not exist because of political volatility. And Mirambika classified to you very clearly as to how, when there is an increase in internal strife, when the border issues increase because of one country aligning with China, the other not aligning with China, because of like countries wanting to have more power, etc., there exists a domino effect, right? Just say that now the currency falls, the economy of the country has a larger chance of failing, which leads to more political instability and economic instability, which leads to lesser incentives for these countries to even stay within the Asian, right? Something which we believe is incredibly important and needs to be analyzed as to why the affirmative thinks that won't happen and the economic incentives will stay the same regardless of whatever the political stance is, right? But on the second level, where we consider the idea of sanctions, right? Understand the Asian worked till now because it did not fear sanctions on the entire bloc as of a whole. Something which will happen if they go ahead and present a united political stance in their best case scenario, right? Which is to say that when there is a fear of united sanctions on whole bloc because of the kind of power one country might hold over the other, then there exists like a fear of sanctions which leads more countries to want to protect their economy and thus back out from the Asian cooperative, because the economic incentives simply do not exist to justify like the kind of harms which will be done, right? For example, like the kind of alternatives which happen, right? But the third is the alternative available in the form of China in general, something which they have repeatedly failed to gather, right? We told you examples as to how like there will be it will lead to like isolation of Vietnam, isolation of Taiwan, etc., because of China domination in case they want these economic incentives, because and the kind of political domination which China has on a lot of these countries, which leads to affecting of policies, which pushes out these countries from these spheres in general, because the policies are now China dominated or now dominated by particular individuals in general, right? Which we brings to like the three major questions in this debate and why we clearly win all of the three questions, right? Coming to the first major question, why border issues and clashing ideologies lead to a toppling political effect in this scenario, right? Understand when the side affirmative's case does not run in a vacuum. Understand we have told you as to how border issues exist between Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc., how Vietnam is against China, how Indonesia supports the Belt Road Initiative, how China's CCP has an influence on Singapore, how China's news outlets exist in Cambodia, leading to political influence, etc. All of these leads to clashing ideologies, which leads to even more political clashes within like the Asian bloc as a whole, which leads to like identity loss and thus a race to the top to be a leader and thus act as a counter influence and protect its incentives, something which the affirmative had to prove to us why won't happen, right? Second major idea as to why international pressure will be better on our paradigm, but also like the courts which they provided do not work, right? Let me tell you as to how China's strong arming and like Singapore and Thailand being like an important paradigm in this general and having Western allies in general will lead to them leading, like for example, Brexit, something which Asta clearly explained in her speech. And the third is the idea of political unionization and why it won't work and detract from the objectives of ASEAN. And for all of these reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose.
All right, now the acknowledges the third negative speaker. May I please request a negative reply? Before that, who's providing the negative reply?
It's going to be me.
Sorry? Miambika, right? Yeah, just give me a second, I'll just change. Miambika, right? The second English speaker? The second speaker, right?
Yes, she was the second speaker. Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Just a second, I'm setting up my timer. Just a second.
No problem.
One, two, three, start. The major clash of this debate has been what will result into an overall benefit for the Southeast Asian region countries, right? Like wherein we tell you that non-interventionist policies will help countries navigate through the complex problems that they have to achieve a common set of goals, which can help the common denominator while maintaining some sort of unison, because there isn't a lot of cost to pay for even other countries, right? In terms of taking very strong stances, even if they have very strong impacts on your country, taking strong stances, even if it does not benefit you in any sort of geopolitical way. We think these are the kind of costs that real countries will have to pay, whose economies are also not doing very, very great. That is a kind of burden and assumption that government has been running on through their entire case, where the solution lies in the fact that you form a political union and automatically countries start prioritizing things of say human rights violations, etc., of one particular country, and unionize together against that country, regardless to what extent a particular problem is going to impact, say, Vietnam, because Vietnam's borders lie far away from Myanmar as a whole. Right? We think these are the kind of problems that they had to address. Why a formation of a political union will necessarily lead to an agreement on majority agreement on certain issues, and hence solution of those issues, rather than like the political volatility that we assert from our side, and we've consistently proved to you why so. Right? We think when countries become politically volatile, when they start taking stances because political problems take major part of discourse in a political union, what happens is that internal problems become become real, become like very very evident between two countries and etc. We think this has a spillover effect in terms of like in terms of like in a political union, if you have to take stances, and because you can take stances depending upon which country you feel is more of a preferable partner, you go forward and take stances, and essentially it results into a spillover effect down the line, right? It results into a spillover effect even if there's a problem concentrated in one region in the Southeast Asian region. We think when regions are divided and are more volatile, it benefits other countries, other neighboring countries, etc. And this is not something which is new at all in the debate, right? This is something which has been running through a lot of years, right? And there's a term for that. The term for that is proxy war, right? Divide and rule policy, right? Something which other countries, for example, here China, can easily go and capitalize in terms of supporting certain candidates or supporting certain countries and giving them extra benefits so that they go forward and help them and essentially isolate the other countries. And we think these factions are easier to form when there's a political union which goes forward and actively takes stances on issues, right? We think all of this becomes very very evident and directly contradicts the other countries' benefits, etc., which is going to result into more volatility and lesser change on their side of the house, which means lesser change in terms of even economics, right? What is a solution we give to you? We think if navigation is going to be appropriate, and if there is going to be prioritization of the kind of economic policies which do not hamper directly with the social problems, we think when countries become economically viable, the social problems also decrease. By creating more economical problems because of poor decisions on the basis of political problems, we think you're only going to make it worse, because that's exactly what happens when you go forward and put sanctions on a country which is not even in a situation to defend all that. We think what has they given to you on this, that the human rights violations are bad. Fine. Why is ICC? Why is a structure like ICC going to work? Is something which they have no answer to. We think even though African member countries are a part of like the Roman Statute of ICC, we think still African Union goes forward and disobeys what ICC wants to do, which is why ICC has been a larger failure. We don't think why it will succeed over here. But in principle, right, we think the situation of these countries is not sole burden on themselves. We think they have seen this because of a large number of years of colonization, etc., which has resulted into a lot of separatist factions, and putting the entire burden on these countries is on a principle level something which we disagree with. But let's close this for once and for all, right? We think there are various degrees of interaction with like China, etc., within the country. Some are very dependent, some are kind of dependent, some want to look for an alternative, and some have the capacity to opt out but are currently not opting out because the economy because they don't have to pay a lot of cost to stay within the ASEAN. We think all these situations are going to get worse off. Countries which will go away, like Thailand and Singapore. Countries which want to look for alternatives because it does not benefit them geopolitically. For example, Vietnam will have to be forcefully continue in ASEAN, which pulls like most of the countries down, etc. We think this results into more sort of restraints on the other countries and more conflicts rising between the borders, etc., which results into worse problems. And we don't never think that is going to solve any social problem on their side house. And because of burden failure, we win from side opposition.
All right, I'll acknowledge the negative reply. Can we please have the affirmative reply?
Should I still keep my camera off?
Yeah, I think it's better because one of the adjudicators is having a problem in terms of streaming. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. In 3, 2, 1. Even with the chance to have the last say, side negative still had to lie when it comes to the characterization of ASEAN. They told us that Singapore is controlled by the CCP. That is factually untrue. Singapore, in fact, if you to compare with the democracies within ASEAN nations, they're in fact the freest or probably the most democratic. Secondly, they said that Malaysia and Singapore has a border dispute right now. That is untrue. We no longer live within the 1960s. Thirdly, they told us that diplomatic relations have always been failing. That is untrue, because if that is true, then ASEAN would never have been an economic bloc anyways. And for their benefit to materialize, they must concede some extent of diplomatic relationships between these nations, because it is to the extent that it's that extreme that even their benefits would not materialize. I have one very quick comment before I move on towards the questions of the debate. The first is this absurd new matter about making it as if that, oh, our courts would not be functional just like the ICC. They did this in the third negative specifically, and they did this in the reply speech. I would just like to point out that those materials should not be considered. But we actually preempted that when we said that in the first affirmative speech, we said that the court decisions will be binding and it's legally binding, just as we see it in the EU courts. If you were to need any more information about that, I think that means that we've already lost that point. I think that's enough. Two questions for you today. How does ASEAN as a political union deal with the threat of China better? And secondly, is ASEAN complicit in the crimes against humanity and oppression that occurs right now? I'm going to be charitable to them and use their context and prove our arguments within their own context. First question, how does ASEAN as a political union deal with the threat of China better? They told us that China is a looming threat in ASEAN, and oftentimes individual states like Laos and Vietnam are strongly within the grip of China. First, this argument is weird because they don't answer this question particularly themselves on how ASEAN controls the threat of China if they were not a political union. Because we think the conclusion of their argument is that at best, the harm is asymmetrical, and what they're discussing is status quo. They're not telling us as to how things change, maybe on the outside of the house or even under their side of the house. We think the harm is asymmetrical. The second response that we had specifically in regards to China was the comparative that we provided very early on. Where we told you that on a balance, countries like Laos and Vietnam are more likely to be able to get away from Chinese grip for three reasons. The first is the fact that ASEAN often negotiate economic deals together, that often they do this already with the US. Those things means that there's already incentive structures provided that they would discuss together or negotiate together. The second is that ASEAN already have incentive to protect each other, because at the point where if they were to allow for Laos or Vietnam to be encroached by China, their interests are also harmed. And this specific line of analysis, which is most important, is that most Southeast Asian nations are already moving away from Chinese investment. We pointed you to the example of Malaysia forcing China to move out their investments in Johor Bahru. We told you the example of Philippines being forced by China and seeing the current behaviors of China not wanting Chinese investment as of right now. That solves the question of whether or not China is dealt better or not. Second question, is ASEAN complicit in the crimes against humanity and oppression? I just want to point out that they've never truly responded towards the principle when we told you that the non-interference policy is what directly causes countries to feel the sense of complacency where they know they will never be held accountable anyways. Then they say, well, countries now are forced to take a stance, and that's bad. Well, taking a stance against genocide of the Rohingya is an extremely important stance to take. That is also a concession towards our argument where countries are unable to previously take a stance and how that have harmed multiple minority communities within ASEAN. That being said, I think I've answered the most important questions in this debate. Very proud to go to the finals of ESL. Thanks.
All right, the Hall Technologies, the affirmative reply. And I thank both of you for a wonderful debate. But before we